Hello, everyone. Tonight, we travel back to the Roman Empire. It was a world where economics and power met. They created a system of casual brutality. Our modern world seems gentle by comparison. Before you settle in, please take a moment. You can like this video and subscribe to Medieval Nocturnes, but only if you truly enjoy our journeys into the quiet past. Let me know in the comments where you are watching from. I always find it fascinating to see our global audience. Now, find a comfortable position, dim your lights, let the world outside fade away. We will ease into tonight's topic together. If you think your modern job search is difficult, just be thankful for one thing. You were not for sale at a Roman slave market. Your qualifications were not listed on paper. They were hung on a placard around your neck. This tag listed your good points and your bad ones. The placard might list many defects. Bites when provoked. Prone to melancholy. Believes he is a descendant of Hercules. All of this was fair information for a buyer. The Roman slave market was a chaotic and grim affair. The most famous market was in the Forum in Rome itself. But many other cities, like Delos or Ephesus, had their own human bazaars. These places were not known for their dignity. Imagine open plazas filled with people in chains. They stood on display blocks for everyone to see. Potential buyers would walk by. They were often large men. They would inspect the people like livestock. They kicked their legs to check muscle. They poked their gums to check their teeth. An auctioneer would shout out prices. It was a very grim version of a home shopping channel. The auctioneer's voice would echo through the square. Lot 27, a strong Gaul. He has limited vocabulary and is good at lifting heavy things. Bidding wars could erupt for special slaves. A skilled doctor was very valuable. A scribe who could read and write Greek was also prized. Attractive young people for domestic service fetched high prices too. Your value was based on your mind or your body. The Romans were brutally efficient. The marketplace itself was like a dealership for people. The sellers used many tricks to raise prices. Slaves were often covered in oil to make their muscles shine. Their hair was sometimes dyed to hide any gray. These were ancient tricks to fool the eye. If a buyer discovered a hidden flaw later, there was little recourse. The seller only had to declare specific problems. By law, a seller had to list certain faults. Epilepsy was one such fault. A tendency to run away was another. But sellers found ways around these rules. A rebellious slave was not described as dangerous. He was described as spirited. An lazy slave was not called useless. He was called calm and deliberate. These little tricks of language helped sellers sleep at night. They also ensured the grim business of the market continued day after day. Let us say you were a regular Roman citizen. You were not a senator or a famous general. You were just an ordinary person with a small villa. You wanted someone to manage your household chores, someone to sweep the floors or carry your scrolls. You were in the market for an unskilled male slave. This was the ancient world's most basic worker. He had no special training and very few rights. The going rate for this type of person was about 1,500 to 2,000 sesterces. That number may not mean much to us today, so let's try to put it into perspective. A Roman legionary was the standard soldier of the empire. He earned around 900 sesterces in a year, so buying a single human being would cost a soldier 2 years of his salary. 2 years of difficult and dangerous military service. Of course, you could also just inherit money from a wealthy relative. The slaves at this low price point were not always in good health. Some were captured in recent wars. They were often malnourished or deeply traumatized. Others were simply unmotivated to work. They were the ancient equivalent of an employee who has no passion for the job. Still, they were a cheaper option than hiring a free Roman citizen. And unlike a citizen, you could use harsh discipline if they were late. The Romans valued this grim kind of efficiency. These laborers typically worked in a few key areas. Many worked on large agricultural estates. Others worked in construction, building roads and aqueducts. The worst fate was to be sent to the mines. The mines were a place of incredible hardship and suffering. If you were sent to the mines, your life expectancy was very short. It was essentially a death sentence with a brief delay. But if you were lucky, you might be bought by a kind master. A baker might purchase you to help in his shop. Your days would be filled with the smell of bread. Your work would be hard and your back would ache, but it was far better than the darkness of the mines. Life as a slave was often a matter of pure chance. Your fate was decided by the person who happened to buy you. There were also options for those who could not afford to buy a slave. You could lease a slave for a day or a week. It was like a very grim version of a modern rental service. A person could request a strong worker for a single day's labor. This provided flexibility for small business owners and households. It also provided a steady income for the slave's owner. Interestingly, even an unskilled slave could become more valuable. If a simple laborer learned a new skill, his price would go up. If he learned how to mix concrete or read a shipping manifest, he appreciated in value. Some owners invested in training their slaves. This made the slaves more useful and more profitable. But not all masters cared about such things. Upward mobility was not a concept that applied to most slaves. Their lives were defined by the price paid for them at the market. So you have walked past the laborers in the slave market. You are looking for something more refined. Perhaps you want a person who can do more than carry bricks. You want someone who can compose poetry, or maybe mix a perfect cup of spiced wine. You have entered the luxury section of the human market. Talented slaves were a major status symbol for the Roman elite. They were not just workers. They were investments with special skills. Educated Greeks were particularly valuable. They were sought after as philosophers. They served as teachers for the children of the wealthy. Some were skilled physicians or talented musicians. And there was the rare slave who could manage your finances. He could do your taxes and also play a musical instrument. The price for such a person was very high. It could range from 10,000 to 100,000 sesterces. The final price depended on their level of intelligence and skill. Some wealthy Romans wanted a slave for simple intellectual tasks. He might read them poetry at night, or he might simply flatter their intelligence. Other Romans wanted a multi-talented individual. A slave who was a dentist and a botanist was a rare prize. He could fix your teeth and also arrange the flowers. These highly skilled people often came from Alexandria or Athens. They were sold like walking toolkits of philosophy and art. The great irony was the slave's objectification. The more gifted the slave, the more he was treated like an object. An owner might boast about his talented slave. This one speaks 3 languages. He also paints beautiful murals. I bought him during a sale last year. This was a common way for the rich to display their culture. They owned it in the form of another human being. Unlike a modern employee, these slaves could not ask for a pay raise. Their only hope for a better life was manumission. This was the legal process of being granted freedom. It was like finally being allowed to quit your job. But the master had to grant this freedom. It was never guaranteed. Many talented slaves lived their entire lives in service. Their minds were free, but their bodies were not. Female slaves with talents were also in high demand. A woman who could sing or dance was very valuable. She could entertain guests at dinner parties. Entertainment in Rome had a very broad definition. It could mean a simple harp performance, or it could involve something much less dignified. Some talented women were treated almost like celebrities, but they were celebrities with no freedom and no rights. These valuable slaves were never sent to the fields or mines. Their place was in the comfortable homes of the rich. They lived in the villa or the private study. Their purpose was to impress visitors. They made their masters look more cultured and important. Owning a talented Greek was a powerful statement. It said, "I am a successful Roman, and here is my slave who can debate philosophy in perfect Greek." In the Roman slave market, beauty was not just a quality, it was a commodity. If you were considered beautiful and you were a slave, your value soared. You could be worth more than a small farm with olive trees. The Romans had very specific tastes. They valued youth and smooth skin. They admired symmetrical features. If your teeth were straight and your features were pleasing, you could be sold for an immense sum. The price might be 30,000 to 100,000 sesterces. Sometimes it was even more if you were exceptionally attractive. That is a staggering amount of money. It was the price of a large estate. You could buy a villa with a view of the river for that cost. Attractive slaves were used for delicate domestic roles. They served as personal attendants or cupbearers. They were chosen for positions where their appearance would be seen. Their beauty was not just for the owner's private enjoyment. It was a public display of wealth. Having a beautiful slave serve wine to your guests was a status symbol. It was like owning a rare piece of art that could also pour drinks. This premium on appearance applied to both men and women, but young women were in the highest demand. Those from distant or exotic regions were especially prized. A woman from Egypt, Syria, or Gaul was considered a novelty. Each region came with its own stereotype of beauty. Roman buyers were eager to purchase these stereotypes. If the woman could also sing or recite poetry, her value increased further. Her skills made her a complete package of entertainment and beauty. Naturally, this part of the market had a very dark side. Special skills were often hinted at with vague language. Young boys and girls were sold for purposes we would find horrifying. We will not go into the grim details, but Roman law offered little protection to these children. The law was mainly concerned with property rights, not human welfare. The seller was protected as long as he listed the product accurately. He could sell a person with a simple label, used for light duties, could mean many things. Sellers used many methods to boost a slave's market value. Cosmetics were applied to hide blemishes. Scented oils were used to make them smell pleasant. Their clothes were carefully chosen to be flattering. Think of it as an ancient form of photo editing, but it was done in person for a live auction. A little perfume and a nice tunic could add thousands of sesterces to the price. This preparation was part of the grim business of selling people. In short, beauty was a powerful economic force. If you were a stunningly attractive person in the Roman Empire, you had two possible fates. You might live a life of incredible privilege, or you might become someone else's privilege, where life could be spent as a beautiful centerpiece in a wealthy home. You would be admired, you would be objectified, and you would be a constant reminder of the price of beauty in a world that sold it. There was one class of slave that was bred for performance. They knew how to entertain a crowd. They knew how to bleed for show. These were the gladiators. They were more than just men with swords. They were walking spectacles with a powerful brand, and their muscular bodies often cost more than a comfortable Roman home. Gladiators were a huge financial risk for their owners, but they also offered a huge potential reward. A talented gladiator could cost 100,000 sesterces or more. His price depended on his fame and his fighting record. It also depended on his chances of surviving his next match. Some of these men were prisoners captured in war. Others were criminals sentenced to fight in the arena. A few were even free citizens. They were desperate men who traded their freedom for a chance at fame and a life of brutal discipline. The owners of gladiators were called lanistae. These men bought promising fighters at very high prices. They trained them in special private schools. These schools were not for academics. They were grim places of constant physical training. The owner would then rent his gladiators out for public games. He received a large fee for each appearance. Think of it as an ancient combat sports league. But the fighters were considered property with no say in their careers. Not all gladiators were the same. Some were low-level fighters. They were expected to die quickly for the crowd's amusement. Others were highly trained stars. They had specific fighting styles and iconic armor. These star gladiators were meant to sell tickets. They inspired artists to paint their images on pottery. They made noble Roman women gasp with excitement. These men were celebrities of the ancient world. They even had devoted fans and groupies. These fans would write graffiti on city walls. The gladiator Crixus makes the women sigh. This was a real sentiment in ancient Rome. The fame of these men was immense, but their lives were incredibly dangerous. For the owner, a gladiator was a fragile investment. If your starfighter was killed in the arena, your investment was gone. Your retirement fund was just lost to a well-aimed spear. Some wealthy owners minimized this risk. They bought many fighters and branded them like animals. There was also a very rare type of gladiator. These were the female gladiators, or gladiatresses. They were a novelty in the arena. Their appearances were theatrical and very unusual. Because they were so rare, they were even more expensive than male fighters. It was one thing for a man to win a fight. It was another thing for a woman to do it. The sight often made the Roman elite uncomfortable. But it was a spectacle they were willing to pay a great deal of money to see. Now we must turn to the subject of children. In most societies, children are seen as the future. They are considered precious and innocent. In ancient Rome, they were also a budget-friendly option on the slave market. If you could not afford a skilled Greek tutor, you could purchase a child. They cost less than a single gladiator's helmet. A child slave might cost as little as 500 to 2,000 sesterces. The price depended on their age and their health. It also depended on whether they seemed likely to survive. Why were they so inexpensive? The answer is simple. They were a higher-risk investment. Children were small and not yet strong. They required years of training and feeding. They were also more vulnerable to disease. A child could not lift heavy things. They could not yet recite classic poetry, but they could perform many small tasks around the house. They could run errands. They could sweep the floors, or they could fan their master during a hot afternoon. Some buyers liked the idea of raising their own slave. They could shape the child from a young age. A little training and discipline could produce a loyal servant. The child would know no other life. The owner could create a custom-made assistant. He might become a household manager. He might become a personal accountant by his teenage years. It was a grim form of adoption. But the child was property, not family. The goal was servitude, not love. Children who were born to slave mothers had a specific name. They were called verni. These children were born into servitude within the household. They were essentially homegrown slaves. No purchase was necessary. Roman aristocrats might have dozens of these children. They lived and worked within the great houses. Their presence was a normal part of domestic life. They performed endless small tasks from morning until night. Of course, Rome had its dark and predatory side. Some wealthy individuals purchased children for grim entertainment. We will not dwell on this topic, but it is a sad truth of the ancient world. Roman law offered very little protection for these young people. The laws were designed to protect property. A child slave was considered property. Their welfare was not a legal concern. Their fate was entirely in the hands of their owner. On a less horrifying but still sad note, some children were given as gifts. A noble child might receive a slave child as a playmate. Imagine being bought for a spoiled 7-year-old. He might dress you in silly outfits. He might give you a foolish nickname. Then he would forget about you when he received a new pet. This was a reality for some. Their childhood was spent as someone else's living toy. It was another sad chapter in the story of Roman slavery. In times of peace, Rome projected an image of a refined society. There was poetry and philosophy. There were great works of architecture, but during times of war, Rome became a vast warehouse of human beings. When the Roman legions marched and conquered, the price of slaves fell dramatically. War was Rome's primary method for acquiring new slaves. Every successful campaign brought back two types of treasure. The first was land. The second was people. Land was valuable, but people were profitable. After major military victories, the slave markets were flooded. The sack of a great city like Carthage created a huge supply. The defeat of the Gallic tribes also brought in thousands of captives. The result of this sudden surplus was a market crash. The price of a human being could fall to almost nothing. These new slaves were sold in large groups. Sometimes a single person could be bought for only a few sesterces. It was a grim bargain for the buyers. Imagine walking through a market after a war. An auctioneer might shout, "Buy 3 Gauls today. Get a free Dacian with your purchase." This is not far from the historical reality. During some wars, there were so many slaves that sellers struggled to find buyers. Roman economists of the time worried about this. They feared the devaluation of human property. But for the military and for merchants, business was booming. This was a great opportunity for the Roman middle class. If you had been saving your money, this was the time to buy. You could finally afford the household staff you always wanted. But these low prices came with a hidden cost. Many of these slaves were not docile laborers. They were former soldiers. They were proud people who had been defeated in battle. They were traumatized, rebellious, and knew how to fight. This was a significant problem for a new owner. Some of the most famous slave revolts were fueled by these captives. Spartacus and his followers were a prime example. They were battle-tested warriors who had been forced into servitude. They were not farmers or domestic servants. They were men who knew how to use a sword, and they were now sharpening kitchen knives in their masters' homes. The risk of an uprising was always present with these wartime slaves. Still, the low prices were very tempting for some buyers. The owners of large plantations were known as latifundia. They bought hundreds of these captives at incredibly low prices. They put them to work in the fields or the mines. Their business model was based on quantity, not quality. The slaves were cheap and easily replaceable. They were often worked to death. This was the ancient Roman version of fast fashion. It was cheap, disposable, and built on immense suffering. Even famous generals like Julius Caesar participated in this trade. He once sold thousands of Gallic prisoners in a single day. The market was so flooded that prices briefly dropped. A slave became cheaper than a new tunic. For Rome, war was not just about glory and expansion. It was also about profit. It was clearance season for human lives. The price of a slave in Rome was not based on simple feelings. It was a complex calculation. Think of it as a grim checklist of human attributes. The final price could change wildly based on a long list of features. There were 5 major variables. These were age, health, appearance, skills, and origin. Each one played a crucial role in determining a person's monetary value. First, let's consider age. Youth was highly desirable, but not extreme youth. A very young child was a liability. An old slave was not useful for hard labor. Slaves in their teens to mid-30s were in their prime. They commanded the highest prices for physical work. Older slaves were sold at a discount like damaged goods. The only exception was for educated Greeks. An old Greek philosopher was not seen as weak. He was seen as wise. His age actually increased his value. Health was another obvious factor. A strong and healthy slave cost much more. Any sign of illness or disability lowered the price. A chronic cough would lead to a significant markdown. A missing eye would place a slave in the bargain category. A person with a limp was not considered a good investment. Their physical limitations made them less useful, and therefore they were less valuable in the eyes of the market. Appearance also mattered a great deal. As we have discussed, good-looking slaves were more expensive. This was especially true for women and young boys. Symmetrical features and a strong body were prized assets. These people were often purchased by the wealthy elite. They served in roles where their beauty could be displayed. In essence, if you were attractive, your price went up. This was a fact of the market you could not change. Then there were skills. A person's abilities could multiply their value. Could you read and write? Could you cook a fancy meal? Could you play a musical instrument? Each special talent added sesterces to the final price. Doctors, scribes, and teachers were among the most expensive slaves. Their skills were rare and in high demand. Your resume of abilities directly translated to your price tag. Knowing a useful craft could earn you a slightly better life in servitude. Finally, your origin was important. Where you came from shaped your perceived value. Gauls and Germans were seen as strong but brutish. They were considered good for manual labor, but not for intellectual tasks. Greeks, however, were the gold standard for intelligence. A Greek slave could fetch a premium price, even if he spent his days criticizing his master's bad grammar. His origin marked him as a luxury good. All these factors combined to create a final price for a human life. If you were a woman and a slave in the Roman Empire, Your life was defined by many difficult roles. Your price was not just based on what you could do. It was based on what your owner wanted you to do. This often led to a life of hardship and uncertainty. We can start with the more common domestic jobs. Female slaves worked in kitchens, they worked in laundries, they worked in weaving rooms, and as nurses for children. They were the essential staff of any large Roman home. A skilled cook was always valuable. A good wet nurse for a baby also fetched a high price. No wealthy Roman wanted their child cared for by just anyone. But even in these roles, a woman was never truly safe. A cook might be expected to serve dinner with no clothes on. A weaver might be asked to recite poetry for drunken guests. The master's demands were unpredictable, and the line between domestic service and personal service was often very thin. Now, we must speak of the other market. It was a market that everyone knew existed, but few spoke of it openly. This was the market for concubines. A female slave with beauty and youth was sold for this purpose. The auction listings used careful language. A girl might be described as pulchra forma. This means of beautiful form. If that phrase was on your placard, you were not being bought to work in the kitchen. The prices for these women varied dramatically. Some cost as much as a trained musician. Others cost more than a Greek philosopher. Wealthy Roman men had a key priority. They wanted to show off their status to others. Owning a beautiful and talented concubine was a major status symbol. It was a way to display wealth and power. She might have a good singing voice. She might have a tragic story of a conquered homeland. These things added to her mystique and her price. Of course, the concept of consent did not exist for these women. They were property. They could not refuse their master's demands. They certainly could not form a union to ask for better conditions. Their bodies and their futures were not their own. They were items to be bought and sold. Some were fortunate enough to eventually be freed. A few were even married by their former masters. This usually happened after many years of loyal service. But this was not the fate for most. Many lived out their lives in the quiet corners of a villa. They hoped their next owner would not be worse than the last. In short, being a female slave in Rome was a constant balancing act. You had to be obedient and useful. You also had to be invisible enough to avoid unwanted attention. All the while, your worth was being debated. You were treated like a piece of pottery with a pleasing shape. We now come to a very specific class of slave, the eunuchs. Nothing, said trustworthy household staff in Rome, like a man who was surgically altered. These men were considered premium property in certain situations. You might wonder why someone would pay more for a person with such a difficult life. Welcome to ancient Rome. Here, logic was often a secondary concern. We should start with the basics of their situation. Eunuchs were usually castrated before they reached puberty. This ensured they did not develop masculine features. Their voices remained high. They were seen as non-threatening figures within a household. This oddly made them ideal for life in a palace or a wealthy home. Noble women were considered safe around them. This was a relative term in an empire with flexible morals. Eunuchs were prized as personal attendants. They were also valued as singers and even accountants. They were commonly used in temples and imperial courts. Wealthy families also sought them out. An owner wanted someone around his wife and daughters who was not a threat. The Roman solution to this problem was grim. You castrate a young boy. You raise him in a controlled environment, and you hope he learns good manners. The Romans paid a great deal of money for this so-called peace of mind. Let us discuss the prices for these individuals. Eunuchs often cost more than other male slaves of the same age. Those imported from the eastern parts of the empire were especially fashionable. A young and well-trained eunuch could cost as much as a skilled Greek tutor. He might be as expensive as a gladiator with a perfect physique. If he could also sing well, his price only increased. Extra value was added if he was quiet and obedient. Of course not all eunuchs lived in wealthy homes. Some were given important bureaucratic jobs. They managed large estates or government treasuries. Some were even trusted with sensitive state secrets. The Roman theory was simple. A man who cannot be tempted by lust might not be tempted by bribes. This was a theory that did not always prove to be true, but it was the logic they used. In short, eunuchs were expensive. They were seen as rare and oddly respected in certain circles. They were like living dolls who could also manage your finances. Their price was shaped by their rarity and their skills. It was also shaped by a twisted desire for a loyalty that was created through mutilation. So yes, in Rome, your resale value could actually go up. It increased precisely because something important was taken away. Buying a slave in ancient Rome was not a simple transaction. It was not like walking into a modern shop. It was more like a choice between two very different experiences. You could attend a chaotic public spectacle, or you could make a quiet deal in a private room. Both methods came with their own rules and their own price structures. We will start with the public auction. This was the empire's version of a huge clearance sale, but it featured human beings instead of household goods. These auctions were usually held in busy public spaces. The Forum in Rome was a famous location. The state treasury was another. Slaves were made to stand on raised platforms. This allowed buyers to get a clear view. They were sometimes naked. Sometimes they were tagged with simple descriptions: good at weaving, or does not complain much. Placards called tituli were hung from their necks. These signs listed basic details like age, skills, and health issues. They were a grim form of advertising. The atmosphere at a public auction was competitive. It was a show for all to see. Wealthy Romans could display their immense riches. Middle-class citizens could look for a good bargain. Experienced traders would buy and sell people like commodities. Bidding wars could start over a handsome young man. A skilled cook could also cause a frenzy of bids. The entire event was a mix of business and public theater. The prices were driven by supply, demand, and the egos of the bidders. Then there were the private sales. These deals were made in quiet homes or temples. They happened behind closed doors, away from the public eye. Here, the most exclusive slaves were bought and sold. Did you want a philosopher who could also compose music? Did you want a cupbearer who was both beautiful and literate? You would likely find such a person through a private dealer. Private sales were more discreet. This discretion always meant higher prices. In a private setting, a seller could easily exaggerate a slave's talents. There were no crowds to question his claims. The buyers were often so rich they did not mind paying more. Plus, the entire affair was less humiliating for everyone involved. It was a personal transaction, not a public spectacle. The Romans considered this a much classier way to conduct the grim business of buying people. There were also wholesale dealers known as mongones. These men were specialists in the slave trade. They would buy slaves in poor condition at a low price. Then they would improve them for resale. Think of them as ancient human flippers. They would clean the slaves up. They would feed them well. They would teach them basic commands and manners. Then they sold them for a much higher price. These men were not considered ethical, but they were often very wealthy. You might think a society with such brutal practices would be casual about paperwork. But the Roman Empire was surprisingly bureaucratic. When it came to slave sales, Rome kept detailed receipts. These records were often etched onto wax tablets called tabulae. They documented transactions with incredible precision. It was the same way a Roman might record the sale of a chariot or the purchase of a new plot of land. Every official slave sale was recorded. This was true for public auctions and private negotiations. The documents listed all the essential information. They included the names of the buyer and seller. They listed the price paid for the slave. They also described the slave's physical condition. The receipt had to list any known defects. Yes, Roman law had a return policy for human beings. This was a strange and telling detail about their society. Was your new cook secretly unable to see? Did your expensive Greek tutor have a serious gambling addiction? If the seller failed to mention these problems, you could take him to court. You could sue him for fraud under Roman contract law. A lawsuit over a faulty slave was a real possibility. It was a strange blend of legal protection and moral horror. The law protected the buyer's investment. It did not protect the person who was sold. These receipts were also very important for tax purposes. Rome was always looking for new sources of revenue. The state charged a 5% sales tax on every slave purchase. This tax was known by a long Latin name. It was the centesima rerum venalium. The money from this tax helped fund the empire. It paid for building roads. It helped pay the salaries of soldiers. And it was sometimes used for political bribes. The tax collectors were diligent. They checked the receipts to ensure the proper tax was paid. This was especially true for sales made at public auctions. Private sales were harder to track. But if you were caught avoiding the tax, the penalties could be severe. Imagine being questioned by an official. You have 3 new servants, but I see no record of the tax payment. This was an uncomfortable situation for any Roman citizen. These ancient receipts have been a gift to modern historians. Archaeologists have found sales records in many places. They have been found scratched on pottery. They have been found in the ruins of ancient villas. They provide a treasure trove of information. They do not just show us the prices of slaves. They show us how organized the Roman system of exploitation was. One receipt from Pompeii even lists the return window for a sick slave. You had 30 days. After that, he was your problem. In a strange twist of Roman logic, a slave could sometimes buy their own freedom. This might confuse a modern person. How can property own its own money? Welcome to the Roman world. It was a place where irony and contradiction were common. This freedom was not usually a gift from a kind master. It was a business transaction. It was a system known as self-purchase. The key to this system was a concept called the peculium. The peculium was a small amount of money a slave was allowed to save. Technically, this money still belonged to the master, but it was often left in the slave's control. This gave the slave an incentive to work hard, and it offered a very faint glimmer of hope. Slaves could earn this money in several ways. A skilled slave, like a scribe or a doctor, might be allowed to do side jobs. He would give most of the earnings to his master, but he could keep a small portion for himself. Domestic slaves might receive tips or small gifts from their owners. Gladiators could earn prize money for winning in the arena. They earned it by surviving. This is perhaps the most Roman bonus system imaginable. Over many years, a slave might save a significant sum. Now here is the most surprising part. Once a slave saved up enough money to match their own market price, they could make an offer. They could offer to buy themselves from their master. It was like walking into a shop and buying the product you are. If the master agreed, the slave was formally freed. This process was called manumission, but the newly freed person was often still tied to their former master. They had legal obligations and social duties. It was like paying off a massive debt, but the debt was your own body. You were finally free from ownership, but you were not entirely free from your past. However, there was always a major catch. The master had to agree to the sale. A slave could have a mountain of gold coins, but if the owner said no, the deal was off. The only thing the slave was free to do was continue to serve. An owner might refuse for many reasons. A prized cook was a valuable asset. A beautiful concubine was a symbol of status. The master might not want to lose them for any price. Still, many slaves did manage to buy their own freedom. Some of these freedmen went on to become very successful. They started businesses. They became wealthy merchants. And in the final Roman irony, some of them even purchased slaves of their own. This showed how deeply slavery was embedded in their world. The cycle of ownership was a difficult one to break, even for those who had experienced it themselves. In the Roman world, the act of freeing a slave was called manumission. This was not always a simple act of kindness. It was a complex economic transaction. It involved legal procedures and even tax payments. It could also lead to some very awkward social situations. Imagine your former slave becoming wealthier than you. This was a real possibility in the Roman system of freedom. A slave could be freed in several different ways. A master could free a slave in his will. This was a common practice. He could also free a slave in a formal ceremony. Sometimes a master simply declared a slave was free in front of witnesses. These newly freed people became known as liberti. They were freedmen and freedwomen, but you should not confuse this with full Roman citizenship. They did not gain the right to vote or hold political office. They did gain the right to own property and pay taxes, and they still owed a great deal to their former master. Why would an owner give up a source of free labor? There were several simple reasons. Freedmen also remained tied to their ex-masters. They became clients. The former master was their patron. The freedman owed him loyalty and services. In return, the patron offered protection and legal support. It was a new relationship. It was based on social obligation instead of direct ownership. Now let's talk about taxes. Rome would never miss an opportunity to collect money. There was a 5% manumission tax. The state imposed this tax on the value of the freed slave. If a slave bought his own freedom, the tax was taken from his savings. If the master freed the slave as a gift, the master had to pay the tax. This is probably why so many masters freed their slaves in their wills. Their tax concerns disappeared along with their heartbeat. The manumission economy created a strange social ladder. Freedmen could become incredibly successful. Some of them ran huge shipping businesses. Others owned entire apartment buildings in Rome. One famous freedman even became the imperial secretary. This proved that a person could climb very high in Roman society, but you had to survive slavery first. It was a brutal path to success. Of course, there was always a condition. You were expected to show eternal gratitude to your former master. This was a legal and a moral requirement. You still owed him a piece of your loyalty, and you were expected to help him if he needed it. If he needed his floors scrubbed, you were expected to help. Freedom was a legal reality. But the social chains of the past were much harder to break. Let us not romanticize the past. The Roman slave economy was an efficient machine of human suffering. It was a system where people were categorized. They were taxed, appraised, and sold like common livestock. This was not a minor flaw in the Roman world. It was the foundation of the Roman world. The empire's roads were built by slaves. The empire's food was grown by slaves. The empire's elite were fanned and fed by slaves. Slavery was so deeply normal in Roman society that almost no one questioned it. Philosophers would write about the freedom of the human soul. Then they would have their dinner served by a person who had no freedom at all. These great thinkers would discuss justice and morality. Then they would hand a mop to a slave. The slave was told to think about philosophy after he finished cleaning the floor. This was a normal and accepted contradiction in their world. This legacy of exploitation did not end when Rome fell. The Roman model of slavery was studied for centuries. The idea that people could be reduced to a market value was a powerful one. Later European powers used Roman legal and moral arguments. They used them to justify their own systems of slavery. The ghost of Rome's slave markets lingered in history. It haunted the world long after the last Roman emperor was gone. Even today, our image of Rome is often incomplete. We see majestic columns and powerful armies. We read inspiring speeches from famous senators, but we often forget the foundation of all that greatness. Tour guides will show you the magnificent arches of the Colosseum. They might not mention the slave labor that built the stone walls. They might not speak of the slaves who died in the arena. They died to make the emperors look powerful and generous. For all of its calculated cruelty, Rome could not have existed without its slaves. They were the engine of the economy. They were the domestic support system for every wealthy family. They were the reason the Roman elite never had to work. A rich man's only physical labor might be lifting a cup of wine to his lips. That wine was poured by a slave. That cup was made by a slave. The grapes were grown by slaves. So what is the final lesson in this story? It is that great civilizations can be built on immense suffering. It shows that opulence and art can be funded by cruelty. And perhaps it shows that we should not idealize any empire. We must always look at the fine print of history. The cost of a Roman slave was not just measured in silver coins. The true cost was measured in lost humanity. It was a price paid by millions of forgotten people. Imagine yourself in ancient Athens. The sun has set. The evening air is warm. The streets outside are noisy with vendors and late-night gossip. But you are stepping into a different world. You are entering the Andron. This was the men's quarter in a wealthy citizen's home. Inside, oil lamps cast a soft golden light. The walls are plastered and painted with scenes from mythology. The air smells of ivy and roses from the garlands. The gentle sound of a lyre sets the mood for the night. This gathering was not a casual party. The symposium was a ritual. It was a form of theater. it was also a field for intellectual battle. Guests did not simply arrive unprepared. They spent hours getting ready. They washed themselves thoroughly. They anointed their bodies with fragrant oils. They carefully arranged their hair. They even chose special wreaths of myrtle or violets to wear on their heads. Every small detail was a statement of status and sophistication. When you reclined on your couch, you were not just there to drink. You were performing a role in a social drama. The room's layout reflected the city's hierarchy. Couches, called clenni, were set up in a horseshoe shape. In the center stood the great mixing bowl for wine. This was the crater. Your position in the room was a signal of your social rank. The host decided where each guest would sit. This was a great honor or a subtle insult. At one end of the room, musicians waited. They were ready to play their flutes or recite epic poetry. Sometimes dancers would perform. Their movements were a blend of art and entertainment. The host was always a man. He was always wealthy enough to put on an impressive display. He alone set the tone for the entire evening. Some symposia were very dignified events. They were filled with philosophy and serious debate. These nights felt like a university lecture, but with much more wine. Other nights, however, could descend into chaos. Too much drink and too many egos created a volatile mix. Insults were traded freely. Couches were sometimes overturned. The noble symposium could end in a drunken brawl. But whatever the mood, the purpose was clear. This was never just about drinking wine. It was about building community and engaging in competition. Every guest tried to impress the others. You could impress people with your wit. You could impress them with a clever joke. Or you could impress them by how gracefully you drank your wine. To receive an invitation was a great honor. To perform well at the party could make your reputation. To fail could lead to public ridicule. In this intense atmosphere, the symposium became a perfect mirror. It reflected Athenian society in all its brilliance. It was messy, competitive, and endlessly fascinating. Once the guests were comfortable on their couches, the heart of the symposium was revealed. This was the wine. But this was not a simple matter of opening a jug. The Athenians had a strict ritual for their drinking. How you mixed your wine was just as important as the wine itself. To drink wine that was not mixed with water was considered barbaric. It was something that only uncivilized people or desperate drunks would do. True Greek sophistication demanded perfect balance. At the center of the room sat the crater. This was a massive mixing bowl. It was often as tall as a person's waist. The sides were decorated with scenes from mythology. The god of wine, Dionysus, was a common subject. Servants would bring in large jars of dark, rich wine. They poured the wine into the great bowl. Then they added fresh water from the household's well. The entire room would watch this process. The evening's first great decision was about to be made. The precise ratio of wine to water was critical. Should the mix be 3 parts water to 1 part wine? This would ensure a long night of witty conversation. Or should it be 2 parts water to 1 part wine? This risked a much more rowdy and unpredictable evening. It was almost never an equal mix. That level of potency was a direct invitation to chaos. The host wanted the night to begin with some measure of control. The responsibility for this decision fell to one person. He was the symposiarch. This was the master of the feast. He was chosen by the host, or sometimes by a game of chance. His job was both powerful and dangerous. He was a referee of pleasure. If the wine mix was too weak, the guests would complain. They would say the night was dull. If the mix was too strong, the party could turn into a fight. The symposiarch had to govern the flow of the night itself. Once the wine was mixed, it was served. Servants used ladles to fill smaller jugs. From these jugs, they poured the wine into individual cups. These cups were called kifakes. They were broad and shallow. They had delicate handles on each side. These cups were more than just functional objects. Many of them were painted with playful images on the bottom. A dancing satyr might be painted there, or a drunken man falling over. These hidden images would only appear once you finished your drink. In this way, the act of drinking became a form of entertainment. A small surprise was waiting for you at the bottom of your cup. So before any toasts were made, the stage was set. The wine was not just a beverage, it was a carefully measured tool. It could lead the evening toward deep philosophy, or it could steer it toward complete chaos. It all depended on the will of the symposiarch. With the couches filled and the wine flowing, the true purpose of the symposium could begin. This purpose was conversation. For the ancient Athenians, drinking was not about forgetting. It was about stimulating the mind. The goal was to sharpen one's wit and engage in lively debate. The guests reclined with their cups in hand. They launched into a wide range of topics. Some were sublime, others were quite scandalous. Sometimes the conversation started with light subjects. A guest might recite a clever line of poetry, or he might challenge another guest to solve a difficult riddle. Men would compete to tell the best stories. They told tales of their love affairs. They boasted about their military service, or they shared the latest political gossip. Laughter was common, but the words often had a sharp edge. The Athenians prized the art of persuasive speech. No symposium was complete without some verbal sparring. At the more serious gatherings, philosophy became the main event. These parties were like informal schools of thought. Men could test their ideas in a relaxed setting. Questions would float through the lamplit room. What is the true nature of love? What is justice? Does the soul live on after death? It was in these settings that famous thinkers made their mark. Socrates and Plato were known for their participation in such events. Plato's famous book, The Symposium, is a record of one such party. That book describes a night where each guest gave a speech on the nature of love. Beneath the ivy crowns and the haze of wine, the foundations of Western philosophy were being built. But even this deep thinking was a form of competition. Each guest wanted to impress the others. They wanted to show off not just their wisdom, but also their style. A clever argument or a perfectly timed joke could win the admiration of the entire room. Conversation was a contest as much as it was a collaboration. Still, the talk at a symposium could easily turn to scandal. Political secrets were a very common topic. Stories of adultery, betrayal, and corruption were shared freely. Some evenings were less about high-minded ideas. They were more about destroying a rival's reputation. The wine made people bold. In a city where reputation was everything, a whispered rumor at a symposium could become a public scandal by the next morning. Thus, conversation at the symposium was never a neutral activity. It was a performance. It was a game of philosophy and politics. It was a blend of laughter and danger. One moment you might be debating the nature of the universe. The next moment you could be defending your own honor from a clever insult. This was the true power of the symposium. Every word and every sip of wine carried a special weight. As the wine warmed the guests, the air filled with another essential element. This was the sound of music. No Athenian gathering was complete without it. After the first few rounds of drinks had been served, the hired musicians would enter. They were often young women or enslaved performers. They carried their instruments into the center of the room. They brought the haunting sound of the double pipes. This instrument was called the aloes. They also brought the plucked strings of the lyre. Sometimes they played soft drums that matched the rhythm of the conversation. The aloes in particular had a powerful effect. Its sound was sharp and piercing. It was not designed for quiet reflection. It was meant to stir the senses and encourage excitement. The philosopher Plato actually distrusted its intoxicating sound. He believed it led men to excess. But for most Athenians, that was exactly the point of the music. As the flutes played, the men would recline deeper into their couches. They were carried along by the waves of melody and wine. Entertainment at the Symposium was always varied. Some nights, a famous poet might be invited. He would recite long passages from Homer's epics, or he would compose new verses on the spot. The guests would choose the themes for these impromptu poems. Other nights dancers would perform for the crowd. Their dances were sometimes acrobatic, they were sometimes sensual, but they were always designed to capture the attention of a wine-soaked audience. Music at a symposium was never just background noise. It was woven into the rituals of the evening. The guests themselves often participated in musical games. One popular game was called scholia. These were improvised drinking songs. The song was passed around the circle from person to person. One man would sing a clever line. The next man was challenged to respond with a line of equal wit. To fail at this game was very embarrassing. To succeed was to earn the praise of your peers. In this way, music also became a contest of cleverness. It was just like the conversations that happened earlier. Even the drinking cups themselves joined in the fun. As a guest drank from his cup, a hidden image would be revealed. It might be a painted scene of a flute player, or it might be a dancing satyr. Finishing your wine was rewarded with a small piece of art. It was also rewarded with laughter and applause from the other guests. Still, the music of the symposium carried a deeper meaning. It was connected to the gods themselves. Music represented a cosmic harmony. It was a reminder of both Dionysus and Apollo. Dionysus was the god of wild frenzy. Apollo was the god of order and reason. The symposium always existed between these two forces. The sharp sound of the flute might push men toward chaos. The gentle strings of the lyre tried to restore order. Between these two sounds, the night found its balance. Once the music had set the mood, the symposium often shifted to another activity. This was the playing of games. Wine did not just fuel philosophy and poetry, it also sharpened the thrill of competition. In ancient Athens, nearly everything was a contest. The symposium was no exception to this rule. The guests were always ready to test their skills against one another. One of the most popular games was called kotabos. The rules of this game were simple, but it required a great deal of skill to play well. A guest would be left with a little wine at the bottom of his cup. He would swirl these dregs of wine. Then, with a quick flick of his wrist, he would fling them across the room. The goal was to hit a target. The target was often a small bronze disc balanced on a tall stand. If the wine hit the target perfectly, the disc would fall with a loud clang. This sound was met with cheers and applause. It was a sign of great grace and precision. But a clumsy throw was a source of great embarrassment. Splattering wine on the wall or on another guest would earn you ridicule. You would be mocked for the rest of the evening. The game was more than just a simple pastime. It was a test of your control, even when you were drunk. Other contests were much more direct. Who could finish a full cup of wine the fastest? Who could remain the most well-spoken while clearly intoxicated? Some symposia focused on these tests of endurance. The symposiarch would order round after round of strong wine. Other parties favored skill over simple consumption. They created intellectual challenges that were played between drinks. But the spirit of competition was always present. There were also many games of pure wit. These games blended perfectly with the ongoing conversation. Guests might challenge each other to create poetry on the spot. They might insult one another using clever rhymes, or they might have to solve complex riddles. These contests were a mix of play and performance. They were a mix of a simple joke and a serious humiliation. To win was to enjoy the laughter and admiration of the room. But these contests were not always friendly. When political rivalries were simmering, a drinking game could turn serious. A spilled cup or a hidden insult could escalate very quickly. What started as a playful challenge could end with real anger. It might end with broken cups and a physical fight. Dionysus was the god of frenzy as well as joy. The symposium was always a delicate balance between order and chaos. The games were a perfect reflection of this tension. If wine was the lifeblood of the symposium, then love and desire were its restless soul. No gathering was free from the theme of Eros. It was present in the poetry. It was discussed in the philosophy. Courtesans, musicians, and dancers moved among the couches. They were not just entertainers. They were part of an atmosphere of flirtation and seduction. The symposium was a place that mixed intellectual debate with raw human passion. For many guests, the courtesans were more than just beautiful women. The most respected ones were known as hetairai. These women were trained in conversation and wit. They could hold their own in a debate with a philosopher. They could also captivate the room with a song or a dance. Unlike common prostitutes, the hetairai had their own reputations. A clever comment from one of them could change the entire mood of the evening. They were admired companions who reminded the men that intelligence was not theirs alone. The symposium was also a place where male desire was openly discussed. This was especially true of the desire for young men. In Athenian culture, relationships between older men and male youths were common. These relationships involved mentorship and affection. They also had a sexual component. At the symposium, these bonds were celebrated and sometimes teased. The line between praising a young man's beauty and causing a scandal was very thin. Many evenings walked that line carefully. Philosophical discussions often focused on the theme of love. Plato's Symposium is the most famous example of this. In that story, each guest gives a speech about the nature of Eros. Some guests praised love as a divine force. Others described it as a dangerous form of madness. Socrates famously argued that true love was not about physical beauty. It was about rising toward a higher understanding of the divine. Lofty ideas like these filled the smoky air of the end. Yet the reality of the symposium was much more physical. While men debated the immortal soul, there was also laughter. There were stolen glances and whispered propositions. Desire at the symposium was not always gentle. jealousy, and rivalry were common feelings. The favor of a popular courtesan could spark a competition between two guests. A sharp insult about someone's appearance could easily lead to a fight. In these moments, the symposium revealed its raw truth. So Eros at the symposium was never just a side topic. It was the very pulse of the evening. It connected the conversation and the music. It mixed with the wine to create something volatile. It was an atmosphere of charm. It was a source of danger. And it was a chance to reveal the deepest parts of human nature. Beneath the ivy wreaths and the haze of wine, the symposium often became a political stage. In ancient Athens, democracy required constant debate. Even a private party could not escape the influence of power. Reclining on their couches, men would let their words drift into dangerous areas. They would boast about their political alliances. They would whisper about conspiracies. Or they would criticize rivals who were not there to defend themselves. The wine was a powerful truth serum. It loosened tongues that were normally very guarded during the day. One guest might brag about his great service to the city. He would paint himself as a hero. Another guest would respond with a quiet remark about corruption. He might hint at bribes being taken in the city's assembly. A man might praise a famous political leader, but someone else would quickly remind the room of that leader's scandals. These conversations were sharp and full of hidden meanings, and scandal was a constant companion at these events. The symposium was the perfect place for gossip to spread. Who was having an affair with whose wife? Who was cheating his business partners? Who was caught in a disgraceful act at a recent festival? The more wine that was poured, the more freely these stories were told. Clever jokes that started out as light fun could quickly turn into serious accusations. To be mocked in this setting was a deep humiliation. The risks of this kind of talk were very real. The symposium was a private event, but words spoken in the smoky room often found their way into the public streets. The famous General Alcibiades was a perfect example of this danger. He was brilliant and reckless. He was famous for his drunken boasts at parties. Some of those boasts later came back to haunt him in court. What was said as a joke over wine could be used as evidence of treason or impiety. Yet the men returned to these dangerous conversations again and again. The thrill of hearing a secret was irresistible. To watch a powerful rival squirm under a clever insult was a form of victory. To deliver a verbal blow disguised as a joke was a sign of great skill. This was a key part of the symposium's appeal. It was not just about philosophy. It was about the thrill of seeing the masks of public life slip away. So politics at the symposium was both a game and a real danger. It was a perfect reflection of Athenian democracy. It was messy, loud, and full of powerful egos. The party may have been a private affair, but it was never truly separate from the life of the city. In the haze of wine and song, the seeds of political success were often planted, and so too were the seeds of political ruin. As the hours passed, the great mixing bowl was filled again and again. The careful balance of the symposium began to disappear. What started as elegant conversation often ended in chaos. The witty songs became loud shouts. The disciplined games became clumsy contests. Dionysus, the god of wine and frenzy, was now in full control of the evening. The line between deep philosophy and simple madness became very thin. Guests who had once quoted poetry with perfect grace might now slur their words. They would shout half-finished verses that dissolved into laughter. Others became very bold in a way that sobriety never allowed. They confessed secret loves. They insulted powerful men without fear. They made wild boasts that no one could possibly believe. The symposiarch, who was supposed to maintain order, often surrendered to the wine as well. He became just another reveler in the chaos. Physical disorder was very common in these late hours. Cups were knocked over. Wine stained the floors and couches. Guests' ivy wreaths slid down over their eyes. A careless comment that might have been ignored earlier could now spark a huge argument. An argument could easily escalate into a real fight. Servants would move nervously through the room. They tried to clean up spills and calm down tempers, but there was little they could do when the frenzy took hold. For many of the guests, this dissent was part of the symposium's appeal. It was never meant to be a perfectly civilized event. It was a controlled explosion of emotion. It was a temporary escape from the strict rules of daily life. Sometimes this chaos would spill out into the city streets. A drunken group of men might form a parade. This was called a komos. They would stagger through the night, singing loud songs. They banged on the doors of their neighbors. They carried torches that lit up the darkness. This street parade was both feared and admired. It was disruptive and noisy, but it was also a recognized part of Athenian culture. To lead a komos through the city was to wear your drunkenness like a badge of honor. Of course, not every descent ended in harmless songs. Some nights brought real danger. An old rivalry could be reignited by a drunken insult. What began as a party could end with drawn weapons. The Athenians knew this risk very well. Yet even in its disorder, the symposium had a deep meaning. To surrender to the chaos was to embrace the god of ecstasy. It was a taste of freedom from the rigid order of society. The descent into frenzy was both a warning and a revelation. It showed that beneath the masks of philosophy and poetry, men were still creatures of raw passion. They were creatures of pride and wild excess. By the time the oil lamps burned low, the symposium had run its course. The last notes of the flute had faded into silence. Guests would stagger out of the room. Their ivy wreaths were crooked. Their fine robes were stained with spilled wine. Their voices were hoarse from hours of song and argument. Some guests were unable to leave at all. They collapsed onto the couches and slept until the morning sun woke them. Others spilled into the streets to join a final parade. Their drunken songs echoed through Athens until dawn. The morning after a symposium was never a pleasant sight. Servants were left with a great mess to clean. The floors were sticky with wine. Broken cups were scattered everywhere. The beautiful wreaths from the night before were now wilted and sad. For the guests, the aftermath was a mix of pride and regret. A clever comment made at the party could boost a man's reputation, but a foolish boast made under the influence of wine could become the subject of public gossip. The symposium was much more than a simple night of drinking. It was a core cultural institution. It was a perfect reflection of the Athenian character. It was competitive, intellectual, chaotic, and endlessly creative. In the delicate balance between wine and water, the Athenians tested their own limits. They also tested the limits of their society. The greatest ideas of Greek philosophy were not born in quiet libraries. They were born in these loud and messy gatherings. Discussions of love, justice, and the soul happened between sips of wine. Laughter and serious debate were mixed together. Plato's famous book immortalized this truth. It showed how an evening of simple drinking could become a deep meditation on the nature of love itself. Even after Athens lost its power, the spirit of the Symposium lived on. The Romans later adapted it into their own parties. They called them convivia. Echoes of the Symposium can be seen throughout history. They are in the great banquets of the medieval age. They are in the intellectual salons of the Renaissance. They are even in the modern dinner party. Wherever people gather to drink and to argue, the shadow of the Symposium is there. It is the desire to mix pleasure with intellectual challenge. It is the urge to speak freely away from the pressures of daily life. The morning after left the Athenians with heavy heads. Their reputations were perhaps a little damaged, but the memory of the Symposium was a powerful one. It was never just about the wine. It was about what the wine revealed. It revealed humanity in all its forms. It was brilliant and foolish. It was disciplined and chaotic. It was philosophical and scandalous, all in the same night. The Symposium was Athens itself. It was an entire culture distilled into a single, unforgettable evening. Imagine you are standing on a dusty battlefield. The sun is hot above you. Then you hear a sound you have never heard before. It is a deep, trumpeting roar. The sound shakes the very ground beneath your feet. For a Roman soldier, this was not an ordinary noise. It was the battle cry of Carthage's most terrifying weapon. It was the sound of the war elephant. These creatures were like living towers of muscle and rage. They were taller than any horse. They were covered in thick armor. Their tusks were capped with sharp iron points. To the soldiers who first saw them, they were mythical beasts. They seemed to come from the pages of epic poetry. They were closer to monsters than to any animal from the known world. The Carthaginians had perfected the use of these animals. They turned elephants into symbols of their power and their terror. Most of these elephants came from Africa. They were the North African forest elephant. This species is now extinct. They were smaller than the giant elephants of India, but they were still terrifying when prepared for battle. They were dressed in protective armor. Their tusks were turned into deadly weapons. Some even carried large wooden towers on their backs. These towers held archers and men with long spears. They could rain down missiles from a safe height. Each elephant was a mobile fortress. The psychological effect of these animals was their greatest strength. Horses would panic at their unfamiliar smell. Men would freeze at the sight of their immense size. The image of an elephant charging forward was enough to break an army's spirit. This was the great advantage of Carthage. They could terrify an enemy into complete chaos. They could turn disciplined soldiers into a panicked mob. But the war elephants were more than just weapons. They were a statement. To march into battle with elephants was a declaration of power. It showed that Carthage was a true superpower. It was an empire that could command nature itself. When a general like Hannibal used them, the message was clear. You were not just fighting an army of men. You were fighting against gods of war made of flesh and bones. Still, the Romans were a practical people. They quickly learned that these great beasts were not invincible. Their huge size also made them slow. Their behavior in battle could be unpredictable. But in this first moment of shock, the war elephant was a terrifying sight. It was the most powerful shock weapon of the ancient world. They were a living nightmare, and for Carthage, they were the key to crushing the will of Rome. Turning a wild elephant into a weapon was a very difficult task. Carthage did not just set angry giants loose on the battlefield, it carefully trained them to become a part of its army. Young elephants were captured in the forests of North Africa. They were brought to special camps. There, the long process of training would begin. Specialized handlers, called mahouts, were assigned to each animal. These men lived beside the elephants every day. They fed them and cared for them. Most importantly, they taught them to obey commands in the chaos of war. Training an elephant was a matter of discipline and trust. The mahout guided the animal with his voice. He used sharp prods and sometimes iron hooks. The elephant was conditioned to respond instantly to these signals. They learned how to march in a straight line. They learned to stop on command. And they learned to charge when the signal was given. They were also trained to endure the terrifying sounds of battle, the clash of swords, the roar of men, and the blare of trumpets. These sounds were a part of their daily life in the camp. Fires were sometimes lit near their pens. This was done to get them used to smoke and shouting. The goal was very simple. The trainers had to make sure the elephant would not panic in a real battle. A panicked elephant was a commander's worst nightmare. It could turn and run back through its own army. It could cause as much damage to its friends as to its enemies. The training was designed to prevent this disaster. It was a long process of building courage and obedience in a wild animal. Armor added another layer of preparation. Craftsmen made special armor for the elephants. They were fitted with bronze or leather headpieces. They wore plates that protected their chests. Their tusks were covered with sharp metal blades or spikes. These changes turned the fearsome creatures into unstoppable juggernauts. On their backs, a wooden tower called a howdah was strapped. This tower could carry 2 to 4 soldiers. Each elephant was now a mobile fortress and a firing platform. But the most important training was psychological. The mahouts taught the elephants to direct their anger outward. They were sometimes given wine before a battle. This was done to work them into a frenzy. Once they were unleashed, they were a storm of destruction. They could trample infantry. They could scatter cavalry. They could even break down light fortifications. The risks of using them were huge, but the potential reward was even greater. They were terror made of flesh. They were the first terrifying move in Carthage's plan to defeat Rome. The first appearances of Carthage's war elephants stunned their enemies. In the 4th and 3rd centuries BC, Carthage fought many rivals. They fought in Sicily, North Africa, and Spain. The elephants quickly became their signature weapon. They were especially effective against lightly armored soldiers. They also terrified cavalry units that had never seen such beasts. Their effect on the battlefield was truly devastating. Imagine you are a Greek hoplite soldier. You are trained to hold a perfectly straight line. You know how to face men with spears and shields. Suddenly you are confronted with an animal that weighs several tons. It is trumpeting loudly. It is charging directly at your line. Your spear splinters against its thick hide. Your shield is knocked away like a toy. The horses of your cavalry bolt in pure terror. This was the reality for Carthage's early opponents. One of the earliest documented uses of the elephants was in Sicily. Carthage was fighting against the Greek city-states there. The elephants were used to break through heavily defended walls. They scattered the defenders in panic. This created huge gaps in the enemy lines. Carthaginian infantry could then rush in and exploit these weaknesses. The elephants were not just simple weapons of destruction. They were tools of advanced military strategy. They softened up an enemy line before the main battle began. Their appearance was so shocking that Greek writers described them with awe. They compared them to living siege engines. In North Africa, the elephants were just as effective. They were used against rebellious tribes and rival kingdoms. These groups were completely unfamiliar with the animals. The elephants created instant fear. Even when they did not kill many soldiers, their presence often decided the battle. The enemy would sometimes flee at the mere sight of them. Yet these early successes also showed the elephants' weaknesses. In a narrow valley or a dense forest, they could be trapped. Clever enemies learned to set ambushes. They would target the handlers on the elephants' backs, or they would wound the animals, but when used on a wide open field, they were almost unstoppable. Carthage learned this lesson quickly. It began to build its entire battle plan around the elephants. These early victories made the elephants a symbol of Carthaginian power. Other nations had strong soldiers. Other nations had fast cavalry. But only Carthage had these living mountains of war, and that gave them a terrifying advantage on the battlefield. For the rising power of Rome, watching from across the sea, the message was clear. One day they would have to face these beasts, and no amount of training could prepare them for that first terrifying shock. No story about Carthaginian elephants is more famous than Hannibal's march. He led his army across the mighty Alps. This happened during the Second Punic War in 218 BC. Hannibal wanted to attack the very heart of the Roman Republic. He did not plan to sail across the sea. He would lead his men and his elephants over the treacherous mountains. It was a plan so bold that it still feels like a myth. It was a gamble that should have been impossible. The elephants were a key part of this daring plan. He started the journey with around 37 of them. They were not just animals in his army. They were powerful symbols of his defiance. To Hannibal, they were meant to terrify the Romans before the first battle. Imagine the incredible sight of this procession. Colossal beasts walked slowly on icy mountain paths. Their huge bodies were outlined against the snow. Their drivers urged them forward as storms raged around them. For the soldiers marching alongside them, the elephants were a source of morale. The men were freezing and exhausted, but the elephants were proof of their commander's incredible will. If these great creatures could survive the journey, then so could the men. But the march was brutal for the animals. The mountain trails were narrow. They had to be widened for the elephants to pass. The slippery slopes were a constant danger. A single misstep could send an elephant falling into a deep ravine. The cold was a relentless enemy. These were animals from the warm climate of Africa. They shivered in the freezing mountain winds. Food was also very scarce. Keeping such large animals fed was a nearly impossible task. Some of the elephants died on the journey. They collapsed from exhaustion, or they were lost to accidents on the dangerous paths. Yet many of them managed to survive the ordeal. When Hannibal finally came down into northern Italy, the sight was a profound shock. The Romans could not believe what they were seeing. Elephants were emerging from the mountains. These were not just soldiers arriving for a war. They were monsters of legend. They had been carried over a landscape the Romans believed was impassable. The psychological impact was enormous. News spread across Italy like a wildfire. Hannibal had brought living fortresses onto their soil. The march had cost Hannibal dearly, but the symbolic victory was priceless. The elephants were proof of his military genius. He was a commander who would do what no one else dared to do. They did not just arrive as simple weapons of war. They arrived as a powerful omen. Rome now faced an enemy who could bend the forces of nature to his will. In December of 218 BC, Hannibal's great gamble was put to the test. He faced the Roman army at the Battle of Trebia. This was his first major battle on Italian soil. After weeks of clever maneuvering, he lured the Romans into a fight. He chose the battlefield carefully. It was near the Trebia River in northern Italy. The Roman legions were at a great disadvantage. They were exhausted and half frozen. They had crossed the icy river at dawn to begin the attack. They found themselves facing Hannibal's fresh army and his war elephants. The number of elephants had been reduced by the Alpine crossing, but they still played a decisive role in the battle. Hannibal placed them on the sides of his army. The great beasts became living walls of flesh. They towered over the Roman cavalry units. At Hannibal's signal, the elephants charged forward. They trumpeted loudly. Their metal-capped tusks gleamed in the winter light. Archers on their backs fired arrows into the Roman ranks. For many Roman soldiers, this was their first encounter with elephants. Panic spread quickly through the Roman lines. The horses of the cavalry could not handle the sight and sound. They bolted in terror. The entire Roman cavalry was thrown into chaos before it could even attack. The Roman infantry tried to hold their ground. They braced their shields. They thrust their spears at the charging beasts. Some elephants were wounded and fell, but even in their death, they created destruction. They collapsed on top of soldiers, crushing men and shields beneath their weight. The surviving elephants rampaged through the Roman formation. They turned disciplined lines of soldiers into a confused mob. Once the Roman army was disorganized, Hannibal played his final card. He unleashed his own cavalry and his hidden soldiers. They surrounded the disoriented Romans. They cut them to pieces. The elephants were not the main killers at this battle, but their impact was the key to victory. They destabilized the battlefield. They turned Roman order into pure chaos. Ancient writers tell us that the Romans were deeply shaken by this defeat. They were haunted by the memory of those colossal beasts. The image of elephants crushing soldiers into the frozen mud was a powerful one, but the victory came with a great cost. The harsh winter was disastrous for the surviving elephants. Most of the animals that terrified Rome at Trebia died in the cold months that followed. By the spring, Hannibal was left with only one, a great elephant nicknamed Surus. He was said to be Hannibal's favorite. By the spring of 217 BC, Hannibal's great herd of elephants was gone. The cold and hunger of the Italian winter had claimed them. Only a single animal remained. He was a massive beast the soldiers called Surus. This name meant the Syrian. We are not sure if this referred to his breed or his origin. But Surus became more than just an animal. He became a living symbol of Hannibal's defiance deep in enemy territory. Surus was said to have been the largest elephant in the entire herd. He was possibly an elephant of Syrian or Indian stock. This would have made him much larger than the smaller North African elephants. His great size and his incredible endurance set him apart. Roman writers claimed that Hannibal used Surus as a mobile command post. The general was suffering from a painful eye infection. He supposedly directed his army while sitting on the great elephant's back. Whether this story is a true fact or a later legend, it shows the deep impression Surus made. He was a creature of immense presence. On the battlefield, he carried more than just his commander. He carried the morale of the entire army. For the Carthaginian soldiers who had survived the Alps, his presence was a miracle. His survival was proof that their cause was just. For the Romans, he was a haunting reminder of the terror at Trebia. He was a shadow of Hannibal's earlier victories. Even by himself, he amplified the powerful aura of Carthage's commander. He made Hannibal seem like a figure who was larger than life. But despite the symbolic power of Surus, he was still only one elephant. As Hannibal pushed deeper into Italy, his tactics changed. Elephants no longer played the decisive role they once had. The Italian climate and the lack of proper food made it impossible to maintain a herd. Surus could not change that grim reality. Eventually, even the story of Surus fades from the historical record. We do not know for sure when or how he died, but his legend lived on. He was the emblem of Hannibal's most daring adventure. While the Romans learned how to fight elephants, Surus remained a powerful memory. He was the memory of their first devastating encounters with these beasts. In many ways, he was not just Hannibal's last elephant in Italy. He was the final echo of Carthage's boldest gamble. By the year 202 BC, the Second Punic War was near its end. The long conflict had lasted for nearly 2 decades. Hannibal was recalled from Italy. He had to defend his homeland in North Africa. There he would face Rome's greatest new general. His name was Scipio Africanus. The two brilliant commanders would finally clash at a place called Zama. This single battle would decide the fate of Carthage, and once again, elephants would play a major role. Hannibal had gathered around 80 elephants for this final battle. It was one last great gamble. He hoped to repeat the terror he had caused at Trebia. He wanted to shatter the Roman lines and seize a final victory. As the battle began, the elephants were sent forward. They charged in a massive wave of destruction. Dust filled the air. The ground shook beneath their feet. Their trumpeting calls echoed across the battlefield like thunder. To Carthage, it was a show of ultimate force. To Rome, it was a familiar challenge. This time, Scipio was completely prepared. He had studied Hannibal's tactics for many years. He knew the weaknesses of the war elephants. He did not order his men to form a solid wall. Instead, he commanded his legions to open corridors in their ranks. At the same time, his musicians blew their trumpets. They created a deafening wall of sound to frighten the beasts. The plan worked perfectly. Confused by the noise, many elephants ran into the empty lanes. They charged harmlessly through the Roman army. They were then driven off by javelin attacks from the sides. Other elephants were spooked by the loud horns. They turned back in a full panic. They trampled Carthage's own cavalry. They created chaos in Hannibal's rear lines. The once feared living weapons had become a huge liability. Only a few elephants actually made it to the Roman infantry. Even these were quickly killed by disciplined soldiers with long spears. The charge that was meant to be Hannibal's opening move collapsed into failure. It created more disorder for Carthage than it did for Rome. Without the shockwave from his elephants, Hannibal lost his psychological advantage. The battle became a straightforward fight between infantry and cavalry, and in this fight, Scipio's superior tactics won the day. Hannibal's army was completely crushed. Carthage was forced to accept a humiliating peace treaty. The age of Carthaginian elephants was over. At Zama, the war elephant finally met its end. The beast that had once terrified Rome now symbolized Carthage's final desperation. Rome had learned, Rome had adapted, and Rome had conquered. With the great defeat At Zama, Carthage's war elephants disappeared from the battlefield, but their legend endured long after their trumpets fell silent. For nearly a century, they were Carthage's most famous symbol of power. They were living fortresses that brought both glory and danger to every military campaign. The elephant perfectly represented Carthage's strengths and its weaknesses. On one hand, they projected an image of complete dominance. No other power in the Mediterranean could use such a terrifying weapon so often. Their presence on the battlefield created fear before a single sword was drawn. For many years, the legions of Rome trembled at the thought of facing them. On the other hand, the elephants revealed Carthage's reliance on spectacle. They were unpredictable animals. They were very expensive to feed and maintain, and they were devastating to their own side when they panicked. At the Battle of Zama, they showed that Roman discipline could defeat even the most fearsome weapon. Still, their impact on history is undeniable. The image of Hannibal's elephants marching across the Alps is one of the most famous stories from the ancient world. Roman poets and historians retold this story for centuries. They turned the great beasts into symbols of incredible audacity and terror. Even after the animals themselves were gone, their memory lived on. They became cautionary tales about the limits of brute force. Rome itself sometimes used elephants in its own armies, but they never did so with the same level of devotion as Carthage. The Romans had learned the lesson of Zama. They knew that discipline and adaptability were more important than pure spectacle. As the Roman Empire expanded, elephants became less of a weapon. They became symbols of victory. Captured elephants were paraded through the streets of Rome in great triumphal marches. They were also used for entertainment in the arenas. The Carthaginian elephant holds a unique place in history. It was both terrifying and deeply flawed. It was magnificent, but also impractical. For Carthage, it was a great gamble. It was an attempt to use the power of nature to defeat the rising power of Rome. For the Romans, it was a great challenge. It forced them to innovate and to perfect the discipline of their legions. In the end, the war elephants did not save Carthage from defeat, but they did secure its place in legend forever. Whenever we think of Hannibal or the ancient struggle against Rome, one image comes to mind. It is not an image of soldiers or ships. It is the image of elephants. They are colossal and armored. They are trumpeting in the dust as they charge toward their destiny. In the medieval world, bread was not just a type of food. It was the foundation of all existence. It was the one single staple that connected the lives of peasants and kings. A person might go for days without meat or cheese, but they could not survive for long without bread. To run out of bread was to face starvation. Entire villages measured the rhythm of their lives by the grain harvest. The mill and the oven were the centers of the community. For the poor people, bread was usually coarse and dark. Rye, barley, and oats were the most common grains for peasants. These grains produced loaves that were very dense. They were sour and sometimes had pieces of straw mixed in. This black bread would fill a person's stomach, but it offered no special flavor or refinement. In difficult times, a family would stretch their flour. They mixed it with ground beans or acorns. This act of desperation made the bread heavy and bitter. Eating this kind of loaf was a daily reminder of your low status in the world, but it was also a symbol of resilience. Even when life was incredibly hard, bread kept people working. It kept children alive through the long, cold winters. For the wealthy, bread told a very different story. Nobles and high-ranking clergy ate the finest white loaves. This bread was baked from carefully sifted wheat flour. This type of bread was soft, light, and very expensive. To be served white bread at a feast was a clear symbol of status. It was just like wearing fine silk clothes. The color of the bread itself was a mark of privilege. It was pure and bright. It was far removed from the dark, heavy loaves of the village. Bread was also a central part of ritual. At meals, large loaves were often cut into thick slices. These slices were used as plates. They were called trenchers. They would soak up the juices from the meat. At the end of the meal, the trenchers were either eaten or given to the poor. This was a form of charity. At church, bread was transformed into the body of Christ. This act of Mass elevated the daily food into a symbol of divine power. From the peasant's hut to the great cathedral, bread connected survival with spirituality. It connected simple food with grand ceremony. Above all, bread was a political force. A failed harvest could lead to riots in the streets. A king who failed to secure the grain supply risked a rebellion. To deny people their bread was to deny them life itself. In every single crumb of bread, a medieval truth was hidden. Bread was not just something you ate, it was the essence of life. It was the essence of power and order in the medieval world. These quiet details are the true heart of history. The price of a person, the rules for an ancient party, the cost of a simple loaf of bread. These facts may seem small and boring, but they show us how people truly lived their lives. They reveal the hidden structures of forgotten worlds. They are the silent foundation beneath the grand stories we remember. True history is often found in these quiet, everyday things. They are the truths that echo through time. Thank you for joining us on this long journey tonight. We hope these stories from the distant past have brought you some calm and quiet. If you enjoyed our travels through these ancient worlds, please consider liking this video. Be sure to subscribe to Medieval Nocturnes for more quiet nights like this one. Your support allows us to continue these explorations. Until our next journey together, rest well and sleep peacefully.